My name is Renee Aldis. I'm 34 years old. 11 days after my husband died, my own sister sat across from me at his lawyer's office, slid a stack of papers toward me and said, "Just sign where it's highlighted, Renee. You don't need to read all of it. I've already been through it for you." I almost signed. I had a pen in my hand. And then the lawyer, a quiet, careful man named Holt, who had known my husband for 15 years, reached across the table, took the papers gently out from under my pen, and said 4 words that changed everything that came after. "I need a moment." 8 months later, my sister stood in front of a judge and listened to her own forged signature read aloud in open court. If this story already has you holding your breath, hit subscribe right now and drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense unless you understand exactly who my sister Carla was to me before any of it happened, and exactly who my husband Daniel was, and exactly how much was actually at stake the day Holt stopped me from signing my own name. I grew up in Spokane, Washington, the younger of 2 daughters born to Marion and Theo Driscoll. My father ran a small printing business out of a warehouse near the rail yards, the kind of place that smelled permanently of ink and warm machinery, and my mother kept the books for him from a desk in the corner, the same desk for almost 30 years. Carla was 4 years older than me, and from the time I was old enough to understand anything about my own family, I understood one thing clearly. Carla came first. Not because anyone said it out loud at the dinner table the way some families do it with cruel bluntness. It was quieter than that, more structural, the kind of favoritism that gets built into a house the way load-bearing walls get built into a house, so completely invisible that nobody questions whether the whole structure was ever designed around someone else's weight. Carla got the car when she turned 16, a used but reliable Honda Civic my parents had saved for 2 years to buy. I got my license at 16 and continued walking to my part-time job at a drugstore for another 1.5 years, because we already spent on Carla's car, you understand, sweetie. We'll get you something when there's room in the budget. There was never room in the budget. Carla got a full ride to community college, covered partly by my parents and partly by a small scholarship, then transferred to Eastern Washington University, with my parents quietly co-signing a loan for her dorm and books that she never fully repaid, and that, as far as I know, my parents never once brought up again. I worked through 2 years of community college myself, paid for everything out of my own pocket from the drugstore job and later from a billing position at a regional clinic, and finished my associate's degree exactly on time, with 0 debt and 0 acknowledgement from anyone in my family that the 2 paths had cost wildly different amounts of effort and sacrifice for 2 very different outcomes. None of this is the actual story I'm telling you today. I'm telling you this because you need to understand the shape of the relationship Carla and I had for over 3 decades before anything involving Daniel ever happened. Because what she eventually tried to do to me only makes sense once you understand that she had spent her entire life believing, somewhere underneath everything else, that whatever I had was technically available to her too, if she simply wanted it badly enough and moved fast enough before anyone stopped her. I should also tell you about the summer I turned 26. Because it explains something about why I eventually trusted Carla as completely as I did, despite everything underneath that I just described. My father had a minor heart scare that July, nothing ultimately serious, a stress test and a brief hospital observation that turned out fine. But in the 3 days before we knew that, Carla drove up from Spokane to our parents' house every single evening after her own job, sat with my mother in the waiting room, brought food, handled the insurance paperwork with a competence that genuinely surprised me. I remember thinking, watching her organize hospital documents at the kitchen table at 11 at night, that whatever resentment had quietly built up between us over the years, she was still, underneath everything, someone who showed up when it actually mattered. I held on to that memory for a long time. I think, looking back now, it was part of why I never built the kind of careful skepticism toward her that I now recognize, with painful clarity, I probably should have built much earlier. People are rarely simply one thing. Carla was genuinely capable of showing up with real competence and real care in a crisis. She was also, separately, capable of everything that came later. Both things were true about the same person, and I think that's part of why it took me as long as it did to fully see what was happening, even with the evidence eventually sitting directly in front of me on a lawyer's desk. I met Daniel Aldis in the spring of 2014 at a regional logistics conference in Portland that I had genuinely only attended because my clinic billing job sent 4 employees every year, and someone had dropped out at the last minute. Daniel ran a small but steadily growing freight brokerage company out of Spokane called Northbridge Freight Solutions, which by the time I met him employed about 22 people and handled regional trucking contracts across the Pacific Northwest. He was 8 years older than me, quiet in the way that confident people are quiet, rather than the way nervous people are quiet, and he spent most of the conference's opening reception standing slightly apart from the main crowd, watching people network with an expression that looked like he found the whole performance mildly exhausting. I liked him immediately, in the specific, unglamorous way you like someone who seems genuinely unimpressed with the room he's standing in. We talked for almost 2 hours that first night, mostly about nothing important: his company's logistics software problems, my clinic's billing system, both of us laughing about how every industry apparently runs on outdated software, held together with duct tape and institutional memory. At one point he asked me, almost as an afterthought, what I'd actually wanted to do with my life before billing and clinics and conferences became the shape of it. And I remember being genuinely thrown by the question, because nobody in my family had ever asked it quite that directly, not even out of cruelty, simply out of a kind of structural inattention that I'd stopped noticing because I'd lived inside it so long. I told him, somewhat embarrassed, that I'd once wanted to study medical illustration, a strange, specific, half-forgotten dream from high school that I hadn't said out loud to another human being in almost a decade. He didn't laugh or brush past it the way I half expected. He asked 3 more questions about it, specific ones, the kind that only come from someone actually listening rather than performing interest while waiting for their turn to talk again. I went home that night and couldn't sleep, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because I'd spent 2 hours with someone who made me feel, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, genuinely seen rather than simply present. He called me 4 days later. We were married 2.5 years after that, in October of 2016, in a small ceremony at a vineyard outside Walla Walla that Daniel had chosen specifically because, he told me, it reminded him of a trip his late mother had taken him on as a boy, one of the only real vacations they'd managed together before her schedule and her health made anything like it impossible again. He'd shown me a single faded photograph once, early in our relationship, of himself at maybe 9 years old, standing in front of rows of grapevines, his mother's hand resting on his shoulder, both of them squinting into bright afternoon sun. He never said it directly, but I understood, choosing that venue, that some part of him was trying to bring her back into the day in the only way still available to him. It was a small ceremony, just under 60 guests, held outdoors under a single large oak tree on the property, with simple string lights and folding chairs arranged in loose, uneven rows that somehow looked exactly right rather than careless. My parents came, sitting in the second row, my father in a suit that didn't quite fit him properly across the shoulders, the same suit he'd worn to 2 funerals and 1 other wedding over the preceding decade. Carla came too, with her then-boyfriend, a man named Greg who didn't last past the following spring. She'd helped me get ready that morning, actually, zipping the back of my dress, fixing a stray piece of hair near my ear, and for those few specific minutes, getting ready together in a small room at the vineyard's main building, I remember feeling something genuinely uncomplicated between us, something that felt, in that moment, like real sisterhood, rather than the careful management I would only recognize, much later, as the more accurate pattern underneath most of our interactions. Carla gave a toast at the reception that, looking back now with everything I know, I can see was already doing something I didn't catch in the moment. She spent almost the entire speech talking about herself, about how she had always known Renee would land somewhere good eventually, with a tone that managed to compliment me while simultaneously suggesting my entire life had been a slightly improbable accident she was generously willing to bless. She mentioned at one point a childhood memory of teaching me everything I know about handling money, referring, as far as I could tell, to a single afternoon when I was maybe 11 years old, and she'd shown me how to count change at a lemonade stand, a memory I don't even fully recall the same way she described it, but one she'd apparently built into a small personal mythology about her own formative influence on my eventual stability. Daniel, sitting beside me during the toast, squeezed my hand once, gently, in a way I didn't fully understand the meaning of until years later. I think he noticed something in that toast that I, still deep inside 30 years of familiar family patterns, simply couldn't see clearly yet. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever had someone in your family who could turn even your happiest day into a small, quiet performance about themselves, so subtle that you didn't fully register it until years later, replaying the memory with new information? If that's ever happened to you, type toast in the comments below. I think there are a lot more of us than people assume. Daniel and I built a genuinely good life together over the following years. Northbridge Freight Solutions grew steadily. By 2019, it had 36 employees and contracts running through 5 states. I left the clinic in 2018 and started working part-time as Northbridge's informal office manager, handling scheduling and some of the lighter bookkeeping, while Daniel focused on contracts and client relationships. We weren't wealthy in the dramatic sense people imagine when they hear company owner, but we were comfortable, careful with money, and genuinely happy in a way that felt sturdy rather than flashy. We bought a modest house in the Spokane Valley in 2019. We talked, eventually, about kids, though it never quite happened for reasons that belong to a different story than this one. I want to tell you a little more about what those years actually looked like day to day, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how much was eventually at stake, and exactly why Carla's actions later landed as such a profound betrayal, rather than simply a financial dispute. Daniel was not a man who treated his company as an abstraction or a status symbol. He knew the names of all 36 employees' children. He personally called every driver who had a difficult delivery week to ask how they were actually doing, not as performance, but because he genuinely wanted to know. He kept a small spiral notebook in his truck for years, the same kind of notebook my father kept for tracking who owed him favors. Except Daniel's notebook tracked something entirely different. Small kindnesses he wanted to remember to repay. Birthdays of employees' spouses. A driver's daughter who'd mentioned wanting to study nursing that he quietly helped connect with a scholarship program 2 years later. Northbridge wasn't simply a freight brokerage to him. It was, in a very real sense, the most complete expression of the kind of person he wanted to be in the world. Built slowly, deliberately, over 15 years, one careful decision at a time. I worked alongside him for those years, not as an equal partner in the strategic sense, but as someone who genuinely understood the texture of what he was building from the inside, which is part of why, later, sitting in Holt's office with a forged document in front of me, the idea of 40% of that specific, carefully built thing simply being handed to someone who had never once set foot in the warehouse during a 16-hour shift felt like a violation that went considerably deeper than money. Carla, during these same years, drifted through a series of jobs and relationships that never seemed to fully land. Retail management for a while, then a brief and unsuccessful attempt at starting her own event planning business in 2017 that folded within 14 months after she'd convinced my parents to put up part of the initial investment. Money I'm fairly certain was never repaid. I want to add some detail here that I didn't fully understand the significance of at the time. During the event planning venture, Carla had asked me twice whether Daniel might be willing to invest a little just to get things moving, nothing crazy. Daniel had declined both times, gently but clearly, explaining that he didn't mix family relationships with business investment as a matter of personal policy, regardless of how the venture might perform. Carla had taken that refusal with apparent grace in the moment, telling me afterward that she completely understood and respected his reasoning. I think now, looking back with everything I eventually learned, that those 2 declined requests sat somewhere in her for years afterward, quietly accumulating weight, in a way she never once let show until it was far too late for me to see it coming. By 2020, she was working as an administrative assistant at a real estate office in Spokane, a job that, by her own repeated description at family gatherings, was temporary while I figure out my actual path. She was 38 years old by then. The path never quite arrived. I'm telling you all of this slowly and deliberately because I need you to understand the exact emotional terrain Carla was standing on the day everything in this story actually happened. A woman who had spent her entire adult life narrowly missing the success she felt entitled to, watching her younger sister build something steady and real, with a husband who, by 2021, was quietly worth considerably more on paper than either of us fully realized at the time. Daniel was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer in January of 2022. I'm not going to spend a long time on this part because it isn't really the center of the story, but I want you to understand the shape of it honestly because it matters for what comes later. It was aggressive. The treatment bought us 11 additional months, most of them difficult, some of them genuinely good in the strange, narrowed way that good days happen inside a terminal diagnosis. I remember specific small things from those months with a clarity that the rest of that year has mostly refused to give me. A Tuesday in March when he felt well enough to walk the full length of our street for the first time in weeks, and we stopped at the end of it just to look at a neighbor's overgrown garden. not saying much, simply standing there together. A weekend in July, when Priya drove out to the house with two other longtime Northbridge employees, uninvited, simply to sit on our back porch and tell stories about early company disasters. The kind of stories that made Daniel laugh in a way I hadn't heard in weeks. The kind of laugh that briefly made the entire house feel like it belonged to ordinary life again, instead of to an illness. Daniel spent a significant portion of those 11 months, when he had the energy for it, quietly putting his affairs in order. Not because he was panicking, but because that was simply who he was, methodical even in dying. He updated his will in March of 2022, 2 months after his diagnosis, with Holt, the same attorney who had handled Northbridge's incorporation paperwork back in 2011, and who Daniel trusted completely. He restructured some of the company's ownership documentation. He set up a trust for the eventual transition of Northbridge's leadership, naming me as the controlling owner upon his death, with a clear, specific provision that the company's day-to-day operations would transition to its existing general manager, a woman named Priya Sandhu, who had worked alongside Daniel for 9 years, and who he trusted more than almost anyone outside our marriage. I asked him once, that summer, sitting together on the back porch on one of his better afternoons, whether he'd considered including Carla in any way in the company's future structure, simply because I genuinely didn't know how to ask the question without it sounding like an accusation against my own sister, and some part of me wanted to be fair to her even then. Daniel thought about it for a long moment before answering, the way he thought about most things that actually mattered to him. "Northbridge isn't a family heirloom, Renee," he said. "It's 22, now 36, people's livelihoods, built on 15 years of decisions I made carefully, one at a time. I love your sister because you love her, but loving someone and trusting them with something this specific and this fragile are two completely different questions, and I think you already know, somewhere, which answer is true for Carla." I didn't argue with him. I think looking back now, some part of me already agreed with him completely, even though I wouldn't have been able to say so out loud at the time. Daniel died in December of 2022, at home, with me beside him, 11 months after his diagnosis. He was 43 years old. I want to be honest with you about something here, because this story only works if I am. The 11 days immediately after Daniel's death are mostly a blur to me now, genuinely. I remember pieces: the funeral home's beige carpet, a stack of sympathy cards I never fully opened, Priya quietly handling several urgent client calls from Northbridge without ever once asking me to make a decision I clearly wasn't capable of making in that state. I remember my parents driving up from a smaller town 2 hours away and staying for 4 days, mostly silent, mostly just present in the kind of way grief sometimes needs people to simply be present without saying very much. My father, on the second night, sat with me in the kitchen until almost 2 in the morning, not really talking, just being there, occasionally refilling my tea without asking whether I wanted more. The kind of quiet attentiveness that felt entirely unlike the man who had, decades earlier, forgotten to buy me a car. I remember, too, the specific texture of those days in a way that's hard to fully convey to someone who hasn't lived through it, how time stopped behaving normally, how I would look up from staring at nothing and discover 40 minutes had passed, how I ate exactly because someone put food directly in front of me and said my name twice, not because I had any sense of hunger at all. I remember a casserole dish from a neighbor I couldn't later name. I remember signing the funeral home's main service agreement and not being able to recall, even minutes later, what specific package I'd chosen, only realizing the details when the invoice arrived weeks afterward. And I remember Carla arriving on day 3, ostensibly to help, immediately taking charge of things in a way that, at the time, I genuinely mistook for kindness rather than positioning. She handled calls to the funeral home. She organized the small reception after the service, choosing the catering, arranging chairs, greeting people at the door so I wouldn't have to. She sat beside me at the funeral itself, holding my hand, and I remember being grateful for her in a way that, looking back now, makes me feel a specific kind of foolish I'm still working through. I remember thinking, in that exact moment, sitting in the front pew with her hand wrapped around mine, that whatever distance had existed between us for 30 years had finally, genuinely closed. That grief had done what nothing else in our shared history ever quite managed to do. I held on to that belief for exactly 8 more days. Holt called on day 9, gently, to schedule what he described as a short, simple meeting to walk through some of Daniel's paperwork, nothing urgent, whenever you feel ready. I told him day 11 would work. I asked Carla to come with me because I genuinely could not imagine sitting in a lawyer's office alone 11 days after burying my husband, and because, again, at the time, I trusted her completely. The meeting was scheduled for 10 in the morning at Holt's small office in downtown Spokane, the same converted brick building he'd operated out of for over 20 years. I remember the room clearly even now. A worn leather chair, a window that looked out over a parking structure, a framed photo on Holt's desk of his own late wife that I'd noticed on previous visits, and always found, in some small way, comforting, like evidence that he understood something about loss beyond the professional. There was a small dish of peppermints on the corner of his desk, the same dish that had been there, as far as I could tell, since Daniel had first introduced me to Holt back in 2016. I remember focusing on that dish for several seconds at one point during the meeting, the way grief sometimes makes you fix on small, irrelevant details, simply because the larger conversation has become too much to hold steadily in view. Carla had picked me up that morning, insisting she drive, telling me gently in the car that I shouldn't have to deal with parking and traffic on top of everything else, a kindness I accepted without a second thought, the same way I'd accepted dozens of similar small kindnesses from her over the previous 11 days. She'd brought a thermos of coffee for both of us. She'd stopped, unprompted, at a small bakery near Holt's office and bought a pastry she remembered I liked, the same kind I used to bring home from a shop near my old clinic job years earlier, a detail so specific and thoughtful that I remember being genuinely touched by it in the car, completely unaware of how that same capacity for careful, detailed attention was about to be turned toward something else entirely once we sat down across from Holt's desk. Holt walked us through the basic structure first, slowly, patiently, the way you'd explain something to someone you knew wasn't fully present yet. The house was mine outright, no mortgage remaining, paid off 2 years earlier as part of Daniel's careful planning. The trust Daniel had established in March transferred controlling ownership of Northbridge Freight Solutions to me, with Priya remaining as general manager under a 5-year employment contract Daniel had specifically built in to protect her position and the company's stability during the transition. There was a life insurance policy, separate from the company, naming me as sole beneficiary, worth $850,000. And then Holt paused, the way people pause when they're about to say something they've rehearsed saying carefully. He said there was one additional document that had come up earlier that same week, a supplementary ownership transfer form, apparently drafted and submitted to his office by a paralegal at a different firm 3 days earlier, requesting his review and countersignature as the attorney of record for Northbridge. The form proposed transferring 40% of my newly inherited controlling stake in the company to Carla Driscoll, citing, in the language of the document itself, the sisters' long-standing informal contribution to the company's administrative operations and the deceased's verbally expressed wishes regarding family equity distribution. I want you to sit with that phrase for a second, the way I had to sit with it in that office. Carla had never worked a single day at Northbridge Freight Solutions. Not once, not even informally, not even helping out during a busy season. She had visited the office exactly twice in the company's entire history, both times to pick me up for lunch. I should tell you something about Daniel's own family history here, because I think it explains something about why the company meant what it meant to him, and by extension, why what nearly happened in Holt's office cut as deeply as it did for both of us, even though only one of us was alive to feel it directly. Daniel's mother, Eleanor, had raised him largely alone in eastern Washington after his father left when Daniel was 6, working 2 jobs through most of his childhood, a cashier shift during the day and cleaning offices most nights. She died of a sudden stroke when Daniel was 24, just as he was finishing his business degree, before she ever got to see any part of what he eventually built. He told me once, fairly early in our relationship, that the single hardest part of her death wasn't the loss itself, but the specific, narrow grief of knowing she'd spent her whole life working exhausting double shifts and would never get to see a single day of the comfortable, stable life he eventually managed to build. The life she'd sacrificed so completely to give him a chance at. He started Northbridge 4 years after her death, in 2011, with a small loan and a single leased truck. And I think, looking back now with the clarity that comes only with distance, that some part of every careful decision he ever made about that company was quietly, permanently shaped by watching his mother's exhausting, undervalued labor and deciding, somewhere early on, that he would build something that valued the people inside it the way nobody had ever fully valued her. That's why he knew the names of his employees' children. That's why he kept that small, spiral notebook of birthdays and quiet kindnesses to repay. The company was never simply a business to him. It was, in a very real sense, an ongoing tribute to a woman who never got to see it, built specifically so that nobody who worked inside it would ever feel the particular kind of invisible, uncompensated exhaustion she'd spent her whole life inside of. Understanding that history is part of why, sitting in Holt's office 11 days after burying him, the idea of simply handing 40% of that specific, carefully built tribute to someone who had never once worked a single shift inside it felt like something closer to a desecration than a financial dispute. It wasn't simply that the document was fraudulent, although it was. It was that it represented a fundamental misunderstanding, willful or not, of what the company had actually been built to mean. Holt slid the document across the desk, and I'm genuinely not sure, even now, whether I fully understood what I was looking at in that exact moment, 11 days into a kind of exhaustion I'd never experienced before in my life. There was a signature line at the bottom, my name, Renee Aldis, already filled in, not printed but handwritten, in a careful approximation of my own signature that I had to look at twice before something cold settled into my stomach. I had not signed that document. I had never seen that document before that morning. And there, in Holt's careful, deliberately neutral voice, was the explanation Carla had apparently been waiting to give the entire car ride over. "I had you sign something similar a few days ago, remember?" Carla said, turning toward me with an expression I now recognize, looking back, as the specific calm of someone who has rehearsed a lie enough times that it no longer feels like lying to them. "When you were so exhausted the night after the funeral, you signed a few things for me so I could help handle some of Daniel's affairs while you rested. This is just the formal version of that going through properly. I had signed something the night after the funeral. That part was true." Carla had brought me a small stack of papers she described as just some funeral home logistics, nothing important. "Sign here so I can handle the rest for you." And I had signed 3 pages, without reading them in any meaningful way, sitting at my own kitchen table at 11 at night, more exhausted than I had ever been in my entire life, genuinely believing I was authorizing my own sister to handle funeral catering invoices on my behalf, so I wouldn't have to think about it. I had not, at any point, signed anything related to Northbridge Freight Solutions, or to a 40% ownership transfer, or to anything involving Daniel's company at all. Holt, to his enormous credit, had clearly already done some quiet investigating before our meeting even started. He explained, carefully and without raising his voice even slightly, that the supplementary document had been drafted and notarized through a different attorney's office across town, not through his own, despite being labeled "for review and countersignature by attorney of record," and that the notary's stamp on the document was dated 2 days after the date written into the signature line itself, which was, in his quiet, professional words, an inconsistency I'd very much like explained before anyone signs anything else in this office today. Carla, sitting beside me, slid a second stack of papers toward me, papers I hadn't even noticed her bring into the office, separate from whatever Holt had prepared, and said the line that I will genuinely remember for the rest of my life. "Just sign where it's highlighted, Renee. You don't need to read all of it. I've already been through it for you." I had a pen in my hand. I want to be completely honest with you about how close I came to signing it, because I think it matters for understanding exactly how grief works on a person, how it strips away your normal defenses in ways that have nothing to do with intelligence or character, and everything to do with raw exhaustion. I was 11 days out from watching my husband die in our bedroom. I had not slept more than 4 hours in any single night since. My own sister, who I had trusted my entire life in the specific, uncomplicated way you trust someone simply because they've always been there, was sitting beside me telling me this was simple, that she had already handled the difficult part, that all I needed to do was sign where the yellow highlighter marked the page. Holt reached across the desk, gently but with absolute clarity in the motion, and took the papers out from under my pen before I could finish the first letter of my own signature. "I need a moment," he said. And then, to Carla specifically, in a tone that had shifted very slightly but unmistakably, "Ms. Driscoll, I think it would be best if Renee and I continue this particular conversation alone." Carla protested, of course, immediately, her voice climbing into a register I recognized from childhood disagreements over far smaller things. The car, the scholarship money, 100 small, accumulated grievances I'd never once let myself fully add up before that morning. "I'm just trying to help her. She's not in a state to deal with all this paperwork alone. That's literally why I'm here." Holt, calm and entirely unmoved, simply repeated, "I'd like a moment alone with my client." And after a tense 30 seconds that felt considerably longer, Carla gathered her things and left the room, telling me on her way out, not quietly, that she couldn't believe I was letting a lawyer turn this into something ugly when all she'd ever tried to do was help. Once the door closed, Holt sat back down across from me and asked one simple question. Renee, do you remember signing anything related to Northbridge in the days since Daniel passed? I told him the truth. The kitchen table, the 3 pages I genuinely believed were funeral logistics, signed at 11 at night in a state I could barely now describe. He nodded slowly, and then told me something that, even now, I think about often. I've known Daniel for 15 years, he said. I drafted his will, his trust, the company's incorporation documents, twice amended over the years. I have never once, in all that time, heard him mention transferring any equity to your sister, formally or informally, verbally or otherwise. I think you should consider, very seriously, that what almost happened in this room a few minutes ago was not an accident. I want to ask you something here, before I keep telling you what happened next. Have you ever had a single moment, one specific conversation, one document, one sentence, where you suddenly had to recalculate an entire relationship you'd spent your whole life believing was simple? If that's ever happened to you, type recalculate in the comments below. I want to know I'm not the only one who has lived through that particular kind of vertigo. I didn't sign anything that day. Holt advised me, calmly and clearly, to take the supplementary document home, not to discuss its existence with Carla beyond what was strictly necessary, and to give him time to formally verify the notary's credentials and the chain of custody on the document itself before anyone took any further action. I drove home alone that afternoon, Carla having left separately, already texting me a string of messages ranging from wounded, "I can't believe you'd let a stranger make you suspicious of your own sister," to outright accusatory. "This is exactly the kind of thing Daniel would have hated, you turning his death into a fight over money." I didn't respond to any of them that day. I sat in my own kitchen, at the same table where I'd signed those 3 pages 11 nights earlier, and I tried to remember, in exact detail, what those pages had actually looked like, what exactly I had agreed to that night without reading it. Over the following 2 weeks, with Holt's careful guidance, a picture started to assemble itself that I genuinely did not want to be true. The 3 pages I had signed the night after the funeral were not, in fact, simple funeral home logistics. 2 of them were standard funeral arrangements documents, real and harmless. But the 3rd page, the one Carla had placed in the middle of the stack, the one I'd signed without fully reading the heading at the top because I was staring at words that simply weren't registering anymore, was a limited power of attorney specifically authorizing Carla Driscoll to act on behalf of Renee Aldis in matters relating to the administration of Northbridge Freight Solutions during a period of bereavement-related incapacity. I had given my sister, without ever knowingly intending to, a legal document she could use, on paper, to claim she was authorized to act on Northbridge's behalf. She had then taken that single, genuinely limited document to an entirely different attorney's office across town, one who, it turned out, did not personally know Daniel, did not know Holt, and had apparently accepted Carla's framing of the situation largely at face value, and used it as the basis for drafting the much larger ownership transfer document that Holt had nearly let me sign 11 days after my husband's funeral. Holt's office formally contacted the other attorney's firm in late December, requesting clarification on the notarization timeline discrepancy he'd flagged. The attorney, a younger associate named Felix Marsh, who had apparently handled the matter mostly on his own with minimal supervision, initially defended the document's validity, insisting it had been properly executed based on the materials Carla had presented to him, including, notably, what he described as a verbal account from the client regarding the deceased's expressed wishes. When Holt pressed for the actual signed power of attorney document Carla claimed authorized her to initiate the transfer in the first place, Marsh produced it, and Holt immediately recognized it as the genuine, narrowly limited bereavement document I had actually signed, not the broader authorization Carla had apparently described to him verbally when requesting his help. I want to be precise here about something, because it matters for understanding exactly what kind of fraud this was. Carla had not, as far as anyone could later prove, fully fabricated my signature from nothing. She had instead taken one genuine, narrowly scoped document I had actually signed under exhausted, vulnerable circumstances, misrepresented its scope verbally to a second attorney, and then attempted to use the resulting larger document, the one with my forged signature on the actual ownership transfer page itself, since the bereavement power of attorney didn't actually authorize her to sign ownership documents on my behalf at all, to claim 40% of a company she had never worked a single day for. In January of 2023, I sat down with Priya, Northbridge's general manager, for the first time since Daniel's death, in a conversation I had been quietly dreading, because I genuinely didn't know how much, if anything, she already understood about what had nearly happened. Priya, it turned out, understood quite a lot. She told me, carefully, that Carla had actually called the Northbridge office twice in the 2 weeks after Daniel's death, identifying herself as acting on my behalf during this difficult transition, asking pointed questions about the company's current contracts, its monthly revenue, and specifically, on the second call, whether Priya's existing employment contract could be renegotiated once ownership matters were fully settled. Priya, with the same quiet competence Daniel had always trusted her for, had simply told Carla that any ownership or contract matters would need to go through Holt's office directly, and had made a note of both calls in case they ever became relevant. They became extremely relevant. I asked Priya, that same afternoon, why she hadn't called me directly the moment those calls happened, and she answered in a way that has stayed with me ever since. "You'd buried your husband 4 days earlier, Renee. I wasn't going to add one more fire for you to put out before you'd even had a chance to sleep through a full night. I figured if it was nothing, you'd never need to know, and if it was something, I'd already have a record by the time it mattered." That single decision, to quietly document rather than immediately alarm, turned out to matter enormously months later, when the prosecution needed precise dates and times rather than vague recollections. I want to pause again and tell you something about Priya, because she matters enormously to how the rest of this story unfolded. She had worked at Northbridge for 9 years, since the company had only 12 employees, and she had genuinely loved Daniel as a mentor and friend in a way that went beyond ordinary professional loyalty. She had started as a dispatcher fresh out of community college, and Daniel had personally mentored her through 3 promotions over the following years, eventually trusting her with the entire operational side of the business by 2019. When she realized what Carla had apparently been attempting, she didn't simply report it and step back. She quietly, carefully began assembling her own informal record. Emails, call logs, the dates and times of Carla's 2 phone calls, entirely on her own initiative, before Holt or I had even formally asked her to. Because, in her own words to me later, I wasn't going to let someone who never once set foot in this building take it apart 11 days after he died. By February of 2023, Holt had assembled enough material, the discrepancy in the notarization dates, Marsh's account of what Carla had verbally represented to him, Priya's call logs, and a forensic handwriting analysis Holt had commissioned, comparing the signature on the ownership transfer document to several genuine samples of my actual signature pulled from old Northbridge paperwork, to formally refer the matter to the county prosecutor's office for review, alongside pursuing a civil action to formally invalidate the fraudulent document and protect my ownership stake. I want to tell you honestly that this was, by far, the hardest part of the entire experience for me, harder in many ways than the funeral itself. Watching the legal process slowly, methodically build a case against my own sister felt like watching a second, slower kind of death happen in real time, not of a person, but of an entire relationship I had spent 34 years believing was simple, uncomplicated, permanent. I cried more during those months of legal preparation than I had during the actual 11 days immediately after Daniel's death, because grief, it turns out, has a strange capacity to multiply when it discovers it was never quite as singular as you originally believed. My parents, when they finally learned what had happened, I told them myself, in March, sitting at their kitchen table in the same small town I'd grown up wishing I belonged in a little more fully, reacted in a way that genuinely surprised me. I had spent 30 years assuming, somewhere underneath everything, that if it ever came down to an actual choice between Carla and me, the old patterns would simply reassert themselves, that Carla would somehow still come first the way she always had. My father, instead, sat in complete silence for almost a full minute after I finished explaining everything, and then said quietly, "She always thought there was more room for her in your life than there actually was, because we made her believe that about everything, her whole life. And I think some part of her never stopped believing it applied to your marriage, too." My mother cried, genuinely, and said something I think about often. I don't think we ever taught her that there were things in this world that simply weren't hers to take, because we never once made her feel like she had to ask. I asked them, carefully, that same afternoon, whether they wanted to be present for any part of what was coming. The civil filings, the eventual criminal proceedings, any of it. My father said something I genuinely didn't expect from a man I'd spent decades quietly resenting for small, accumulated unfairnesses. I think we forfeited some of our right to a front row seat in this one, a long time before this particular thing happened, he said. We'll be here for you, whatever you need from us, but I don't think either of us has earned the right to tell you how to feel about your sister right now. It was, as far as I can remember, the most directly self-aware thing my father had ever said to me in my entire life, and it changed something quietly between us that has held steady ever since. Carla, for her part, did not go quietly. She hired her own attorney in the spring of 2023, a woman who, within roughly 6 weeks, formally withdrew from the case after reviewing the full body of evidence Holt's office had compiled, citing in her withdrawal letter language that was professionally restrained but unmistakable in its meaning, that she could not, in good conscience, continue to represent a position she now believed to be factually and legally unsustainable. Carla went through 2 more attorneys over the following several months, each relationship ending faster than the last, until by the late summer of 2023, she was representing herself, filing increasingly erratic motions that the court repeatedly denied, including one extraordinary filing in August, arguing that the entire forensic handwriting analysis should be disregarded because the expert witness had, in her words, an obvious bias toward institutional authority. During this same period, Carla began posting periodically on social media, never naming me directly, but in language that anyone in the family could clearly recognize. Vague, wounded posts about people who turn grief into a weapon against the people who showed up for them, about watching your own flesh and blood believe strangers over family. A cousin forwarded me several of these posts, unprompted, clearly uncertain whether I'd already seen them. I read each one exactly once and then made a deliberate choice not to respond, publicly or privately. A discipline that took considerably more effort than I think it looks like from the outside. The criminal matter moved more slowly, as these things generally do. But by the fall of 2023, the county prosecutor's office had formally filed charges against Carla for forgery and attempted fraud related to the ownership transfer document, based primarily on the combination of the handwriting analysis, Marsh's testimony regarding what Carla had verbally represented to him, and the notarization timeline discrepancy that had first caught Holt's attention in that very first meeting. Marsh himself, the younger attorney who had originally drafted the document, ultimately testified for the prosecution rather than facing potential liability himself, explaining under questioning that he had genuinely believed Carla's account of the family's verbal arrangement, and had not independently verified the scope of the bereavement power of attorney she had presented to him as supposed proof of her authority to initiate the transfer. The trial took place in March of 2024, 15 months after Daniel's death. I want to tell you, honestly, that I did not feel any particular sense of triumph sitting in that courtroom, despite how this story might sound from the outside. I felt mostly a kind of exhausted, complicated grief that had very little room left over for satisfaction. I sat in the second row of the gallery each day, beside my parents and, on 2 of the 4 trial days, beside Priya, who had quietly rearranged her own schedule at Northbridge to be there, without ever once asking me whether I wanted the company there. I watched my own sister, the same person who had given me piggyback rides home from elementary school when our parents worked late, sit at a defense table and listen to a forensic document examiner explain, in careful technical detail, exactly why the signature on the ownership transfer document did not match the genuine pressure patterns, letter formation, and stroke consistency of my actual handwriting, captured across multiple verified samples spanning several years. The courtroom itself was smaller than I'd expected, almost intimate in a way that made the entire proceeding feel stranger, more personal, than the impersonal grandeur I'd half-pictured from television. The prosecutor, a careful, unhurried woman named Adriana Cole, built her case methodically over the 4 days, calling Holt first to establish the timeline, then Marsh, the younger attorney, who testified with visible discomfort about exactly what Carla had told him verbally to secure his cooperation in drafting the transfer document. Then Priya, who calmly read aloud the dates and contents of the 2 phone calls she'd documented 11 months earlier. Then finally Dr. Patel, the forensic examiner, as the prosecution's closing and most technically decisive witness. The forensic examiner, a methodical woman named Dr. Patel, who had spent over 20 years analyzing question documents for both civil and criminal cases across the Pacific Northwest, testified for nearly 2 hours. She walked the jury through enlarged comparison images projected on a screen, my genuine signature from a 2019 mortgage document, beside the signature on the fraudulent ownership transfer. The subtle, but, to a trained eye, completely unmistakable differences in how the letters connected, how much pressure was applied at the start and end of each stroke, the slight hesitation marks visible under magnification that appear when someone is carefully copying a signature rather than writing their own name from years of unconscious muscle memory. In my professional opinion, formed after 23 years analyzing question documents, she said, in a tone so calm it somehow landed harder than if she'd been dramatic about it, this signature was not produced by the same individual who produced the comparison samples. The probability that these represent the same author's natural signature is, in my assessment, vanishingly small. I want to describe one specific moment from the trial in more detail, because it has stayed with me more vividly than almost anything else from those 4 days. On the second day, during Dr. Patel's testimony, Carla interrupted twice without being recognized by the judge, the second time standing up entirely from the defense table to declare, loudly enough that several jurors visibly flinched, that the entire analysis was junk science designed to make ordinary people look like criminals for trusting their own family. The judge, a measured, soft-spoken man named Judge Ferris, who had presided over the county court for nearly 18 years, calmly informed her that further outbursts would result in her removal from the courtroom for the remainder of the proceeding, a warning she apparently took seriously enough to sit through the rest of the testimony in tense, visibly furious silence. During a recess that same afternoon, I passed Carla briefly in the hallway outside the courtroom, the first time we had been within speaking distance of each other since the day in Holt's office 16 months earlier. She looked at me for a long moment, and I genuinely could not read her expression. Not quite anger, not quite remorse, something closer to a kind of bewildered disbelief, as though some part of her still couldn't fully process how a single document, a single moment of opportunistic timing, had unraveled into all of this. She didn't say anything. Neither did I. We simply stood roughly 10 feet apart in a fluorescent-lit hallway for what felt like a very long time before her newest attorney, by then her third, soon to be dismissed in favor of self-representation, gently guided her back toward a side room. Carla, representing herself by that point, attempted a cross-examination that lasted less than 4 minutes before the judge, with visible patience wearing thin, suggested she might want to reconsider her approach. She had no actual rebuttal to offer beyond repeating, several times, a version of the same claim she'd made in Holt's office 15 months earlier, that she had simply been trying to help, that the family had always discussed sharing things, that I myself had once told her, years earlier, at some family gathering neither of us could specifically date, that if anything ever happened to Daniel, of course we'd all be taken care of together as a family. I genuinely do not remember ever saying anything resembling that sentence, and no witness, including our own parents, could recall it either. But I want to be fair and acknowledge that I cannot prove with certainty that some version of an offhand, generous comment was never made at some point over the years. What I can tell you with absolute certainty is that an offhand comment at a family barbecue, even if one was made, is not a legal transfer of ownership in a privately held company, and the jury, after deliberating for just under 3 hours, clearly agreed. Carla was convicted on the forgery charge and on a separate count related to the fraudulent notarization, though acquitted on a more serious charge the prosecution had initially pursued, involving attempted grand theft, which required proving she had successfully obtained the property rather than merely attempted to. The judge, at sentencing in May of 2024, gave her 18 months, with all but 90 days suspended in favor of 5 years of probation, restitution to cover the legal costs both Holt's office and Northbridge had incurred during the investigation and trial, and a formal restraining order preventing any contact with me or with Northbridge Freight Solutions for the duration of her probation. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened during this period, something I haven't mentioned yet because it didn't come to light until partway through the trial preparation itself. In November of 2023, I received an unexpected email from Greg, Carla's old boyfriend from years earlier, the one who'd attended my wedding and disappeared from her life not long after. He'd heard, through a mutual acquaintance, vague rumors about some legal thing involving Carla, and he reached out, he said, because something about it had been sitting uncomfortably with him for years, something he'd never told anyone because at the time, it had felt like none of his business. He told me that back in 2017, during the brief window when Carla's event planning business was still operating, he'd discovered by accident that she'd quietly created a near-identical replica of an invoice template from a competing local planner, changing only the logo and contact information, apparently to make her own client materials look more established than they actually were. He'd confronted her about it gently at the time, he said, and she'd brushed it off completely, telling him he was overreacting, that everyone borrows ideas, that's just how business works. He'd let it go because the relationship was already ending for other reasons, and because, in his words, it felt like such a small thing at the time compared to everything else going on. He told me he wasn't sharing this to pile on or to make himself feel better about an old relationship. He was sharing it because, in hindsight, knowing what he now understood about the forged ownership document, the invoice template incident suddenly looked like part of a much longer pattern, rather than an isolated lapse in judgment from a stressed business owner. I passed the email along to Holt, who confirmed it wasn't directly admissible as evidence in the forgery case itself, since it was unrelated hearsay about a different incident years earlier with no documentary proof remaining. But it mattered to me privately, in a way that had nothing to do with the courtroom. It helped me finally let go of a question I'd been quietly turning over for months, whether what Carla had done was some kind of singular, desperate aberration born entirely out of grief-adjacent opportunism, or whether it was simply the largest, highest-stakes expression of something that had always been present in her, something I'd simply never been positioned to see clearly before, because it had never previously involved anything large enough for me to notice. I did not respond to Greg's email beyond a brief thank you. I think about it occasionally even now, the strange way that distant, half-forgotten relationships sometimes hold small pieces of truth about a person that the people closest to them never get access to, simply because of when and how those particular relationships happen to end. I did not attend the sentencing hearing in person. I sat in my car in the courthouse parking lot that morning for almost 40 minutes, trying to decide whether I had the capacity to walk inside, and ultimately decided I didn't, and that this particular decision, after everything, was allowed to simply be mine to make without anyone else's input. Holt called me that evening with the outcome, and I remember sitting on my back porch, the same porch Daniel and I had added on together in 2020 over one long, exhausting, happy summer weekend, and feeling something that wasn't quite relief and wasn't quite grief, but existed somewhere uncomfortably between the two, a feeling I still don't have an entirely accurate word for even now. I want to pause here and ask you something, because I think it's the real heart of this entire story, more than the courtroom drama or the forged signature itself. Have you ever had to grieve two losses at once, the death of someone you loved and the slow, separate death of your belief that someone else in your life would never, under any circumstances, take advantage of that first loss? If that's ever happened to you, I want to hear about it, genuinely, in the comments below. In the months following the trial, Northbridge Freight Solutions continued operating exactly the way Daniel had carefully designed it to, under my ownership and Priya's day-to-day management, growing modestly through 2024, adding 4 new client contracts, and, in October of that year, finally moving into a larger office space that Daniel had been quietly planning before his diagnosis ever interrupted those particular plans. I formally promoted Priya to a partnership stake in the company in early 2025, a decision I made entirely independently, not because anyone asked me to, but because watching her quietly, methodically protect both Daniel's legacy and my own interests during the worst 11 days of my life, without ever once asking for credit or recognition, taught me something concrete about what loyalty actually looks like when it isn't performing for an audience. I made a point that same spring of personally visiting the new warehouse floor every Friday afternoon, something Daniel had done religiously for 15 years, and something I'd never done myself while he was alive, mostly because I'd never felt it was fully my place to. I learned, slowly, the names of drivers I'd only ever known as voices on the office phone. I learned that one of our longest-tenured drivers, a quiet man named Felipe, who'd been with the company since 2013, kept a small photo of Daniel taped inside his truck's sun visor, something nobody had ever told me about, something I only discovered because he mentioned it almost shyly one Friday afternoon, worried I might find it strange. I told him I didn't find it strange at all, I told him I thought Daniel would have been deeply moved to know it was there, and I meant it completely. I also started that same year a small program at Northbridge that Daniel had once mentioned wanting to create, but never found the time for before his diagnosis interrupted everything. A modest scholarship fund for employees' children pursuing post-secondary education, funded partly by the company and partly by me personally, named, with Priya's full encouragement, the Aldous Family Scholarship. The first recipient, in the fall of 2025, was Felipe's daughter, beginning a nursing program at a community college outside Spokane. I drove to the small ceremony Priya organized for it myself, sat in the third row, and cried in a way that felt, for the first time in nearly 3 years, entirely uncomplicated by anything except simple, ordinary pride. My parents and I talk regularly now, more honestly than we ever did before any of this happened, in a way I think genuinely surprised all three of us. My mother told me, on a visit in late 2024, that she had started, very slowly and very privately, reaching out to a therapist herself, in her 70s, specifically to try to understand the patterns she and my father had built into our family across 4 decades, patterns that she now recognized had genuinely shaped Carla into someone who believed, on some level too deep for her to fully examine, that whatever I built would eventually become available to her too, if she simply moved quickly enough before anyone formally stopped her. My father, for his part, started doing something smaller but, to me, equally meaningful. He began calling me every other Sunday, unprompted, simply to ask how Northbridge was going, what specific challenges I was navigating that week, the kind of detailed, sustained curiosity he had spent decades reserving almost entirely for Carla's various ventures, while mine quietly went unasked about. I don't think he fully realizes, even now, how much that particular ordinary habit has meant to me. I've never told him directly because some things, I've found, land more honestly when they're simply allowed to keep happening rather than being formally acknowledged out loud. I have had exactly one piece of communication from Carla since her sentencing, a single handwritten letter that arrived in June of 2024, which I have not opened. It sits in the same drawer in my kitchen where I once briefly kept the original fraudulent ownership transfer document before Holt's office took permanent custody of it as part of the legal record. I don't know if I will ever open that letter. I genuinely don't know if not opening it represents strength or simply a different kind of avoidance, and I've made a deliberate decision to stop requiring myself to have a confident, finished answer to that question before I'm ready. Daniel has been gone for just over 2 years now. I think about him daily, obviously, in the ordinary, unremarkable way grief eventually settles into ordinary life rather than disappearing from it. There are still small, specific things that catch me off guard without warning. The particular brand of coffee he insisted on, still sitting in our pantry because I haven't been able to throw it out and haven't started drinking it either. A voicemail I've kept saved on my phone for over 2 years now, 11 seconds long, him simply asking me to grab milk on the way home. His voice so completely ordinary and unguarded that I sometimes play it just to remember what his voice sounded like when he wasn't trying to be strong for me during the illness. I also think, more often than I expected to, about the specific, quiet decision Holt made in that office 11 days after the funeral. The simple act of reaching across a desk and taking a pen out from under my hand before I could finish writing my own name on a document that would have quietly handed away part of what my husband spent 15 years building. I think about how close that moment came to going entirely differently, how thin the margin actually was between the life I'm living now and a completely different one, decided not by a dramatic confrontation, but by 4 small words spoken calmly across a desk. I need a moment. I asked Holt once, much later, after the trial had concluded, what exactly had made him suspicious quickly enough to stop me before I'd even finished the signature. He told me it was a combination of small things. The notarization date discrepancies, certainly, but also, he admitted, something subtler, watching the specific way Carla had positioned the papers in front of me, angled slightly toward herself rather than toward me. The way she'd said, "You don't need to read all of it," with just slightly too much confidence for someone genuinely trying to lighten a grieving person's burden, rather than someone trying to move quickly past a moment of careful scrutiny. 15 years of doing this work teaches you to notice the difference between someone helping and someone managing, he said. It's a small difference, most of the time. That day, it wasn't small at all, once I actually looked at it directly. I think about that distinction often now, the difference between someone genuinely helping and someone quietly managing a situation toward their own benefit. because I think it's the single most useful thing I took away from the entire experience, more useful even than the legal outcome itself. It's changed how I watch people in ordinary moments now. Not in a paranoid or suspicious way, I hope, but in a more attentive one, noticing, the way Holt apparently always had, the small difference between someone sitting beside you because they love you and someone sitting beside you because they're positioning themselves for something they haven't said out loud yet. If you've ever had someone close to you try to take advantage of your absolute worst moment, not a stranger, not someone easy to suspect, but someone who had spent your entire life being family, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me honestly, do you think I should ever open that letter? Or is it allowed to simply stay closed forever? Subscribe if this story meant something to you. I read every single comment, every single one.